believe must be the 30th final take. You will hear stuttering. You will hear awkward pauses. You will hear me saying scratch that as I decided I didn't mean the sentence anymore. You could ask why I don't just fix this in editing, and trust me, I have tried. So without further ado, we are now going to be discussing LGBT representation in media. Now, first things first, why the bien is this important? Media tends to have a much larger effect on us than we would like to think. This can be shown in how the bien advertisements have been able to brainwash people to buying garbage that they never want and to worm their evil little ways into our minds so that we want to just have a very strongly worded talk with that horrible ostrich. However, it can also be used for good. And media can be able to teach us lessons, show us character relationships that we never would have been able to understand in real life, especially for those hermit-dwelling people like yours truly. And one of the best, now that we have established why it is important to see representation in media, we are going to move on to the good examples, the bad, and the mediocre. Now, one of the best examples here is Nat Has-Been Hotel. That's its sister show, Hell of a Boss! In it, we're going to see a bunch of people on the LGBT spectrum, and one of the best examples, and my favorite, is Moxie's example of bisexuality. In real life, women who are bisexual are often told that they're faking it for male attention. Men who are bisexual are just seen as gay because for some reason that's not valid. And even characters in media representation, or at least in the past, it has been shown that their bisexuality is extremely dependent on the people that they are with rather than with the individual themselves, and thus they tend to be shown in unflattering lights, encouraging extreme amounts of promiscuity. Here, though, we actually get to see a normal person who's bisexual. He's lovingly married to his wife, they have a wonderful relationship that has its own problems on occasion, but that doesn't erase the fact that he's bisexual. He still has exes that were dudes, he still has celebrity crushes, and the best thing of all, we actually get to see how it's addressed by the family, because his own father has the negative stereotype thing of all, if you like men, you're just gay. And we get to see how he addresses that, albeit to little consequences. Frankly, his father is questionable. But the fact that it is brought up and mentioned in the show is just wonderful. And we also get to see a spectrum of homosexual relationships, ranging from extremely healthy to, again, questionable. And it's nice in order to see the variation, because in very early representations, homosexuality was only reserved for evil characters, in the same way that sexuality in general was also only reserved for evil characters. And while we have since evolved representation in that way, media at some point tried to overbalance it, and it went in the opposite direction, where, frankly, the characters that were represented were so perfect and so centralized on their representation that they stopped being interesting. They stopped being people, and they stopped being something that you'd actually want to see represented. But with this spectrum, we are allowed to see couples that can range from healthy to toxic, and it is shown that it's not just because of the homosexual, it's just a relationship thing, and it helps normalize it. Which is very fun, because this show deals with very many topics such as self-worth, self-loathing, trauma, all of that sort, and it's magnificent. In the final character of the show that we're going to be talking about on the LGBT spectrum is Sally Mae, Millie's sister. In this show, imps are what we get to see identified as trans the most, because females tend to have the characteristic of black hair, and mostly black horns, while males tend to have more striped horns and white hair. And here you can see that she does dye her hair black. Now this lovely character is just one that we love. She has a personality, she has sass, she has a wonderful dynamic with her sister, with her own concerns and problems, and it's never brought up and the fact that she's trans never becomes her entire personality, as it often has with worse representations. And while that can be valid, it tends to distance people from the character. As characters, unlike people, we want interest. And if you're a one-trick pony, then frankly, character stops becoming interesting. The next show that we're going to be talking about that has a wonderful representation is Twilight of the Gods, one of the newest ones, and easily obsessive ones. And we see many bisexual characters such as Sigrid and... I differently pronounce her name. That was quite It's okay, moving on. But also Egil was the most important one for the representations of bisexuality, as it is the most involved to his character. In it we get to see the history of how in his culture it is frowned upon in order to deal with men, and we get to see him face the consequences for it, having to fight his lover's brother based off of the allegations that he was doing exactly what he was doing. Which is very fun because a lot of the representations that we see now tend to come in a world that is a bit more accepting, and it's just very interesting in order to see the other dynamic of how self-internalized hatred and consequences can be seen through that. We also get to see another wonderful trans character known as the Sidkana, my absolute favorite character because, frankly, her powers are magnificent. But we also get to see the variation of how transness can tend to be portrayed. In this story, Sidkana was born a boy, raised as a girl, inherited the absolute wonderful power of being able to see into the future with the entrails of anything. And it can also be seen that how in this culture it tends to be over-exaggerated, dramatized, and etc., where it was suggested that by poets or people who had heard of the story and over-exaggerated, that her mother had eaten her child in order to gain the insight of seeing into the future. And we get to see just how things are passed from ear to mouth in order tend to become exaggerated and vilified until they are no longer part of the truth. And that is a main concept of the show, which is frankly beautiful. Speaking of villainization, while there is a point to showing good characters, there's also just a wonderful fun to poking fun of the ones who are hypocrites. In The Boys, we get to see a bit of representation for bisexuality, but it's frankly not anything that I haven't covered in the previous slides and isn't going to add much. What we do get to see, though, is the struggles of what one character actually is versus what they need to be, along with the absolute ridiculous amount of hate that they can get for. For example, Ezekiel is a homosexual character, and yet, because of his name and his association with the church, he is forced in order to constantly hide that fact, to publicly shame it, and is seen as, frankly, quite the hypocrite that can be blackmailed into doing quite a few things simply because of how ashamed of his identity he is. And frankly, that can be said with a lot of superheroes. Another character that we get to see is Firecracker, which this gorgeous woman is one of the funniest characters to, let's say, point and laugh at. Because she overhypes the amount of hate, the amount of distaste, and completely over-exaggerated to the point of any relation to it, you simply can't help but look at and laugh. And I think that's part of what can help it, because it's not just important in order to show how normal it is to be LGBT, but frankly how ridiculous it is in order to be so distasteful and hateful towards it. And this show does a wonderful job at being able to poke fun at the characters. But now that we have spoken of superheroes, it would be a shame if we did not talk about the one, the only, the best, DC! Anyone who says Marvel's wrong. And this is partially because they have had a history of LGBT representation for a very long time. along with non-binary representation, which is relatively new and still not the best handled in shows. While there are many bisexual characters throughout, such as Harley Quinn, Calderon, etc., the character I currently want to talk about is Halo. A character who identifies as non-binary, and we get to see the journey of them discovering that they prefer that identity. While they originally start out with female pronouns, all of that sort, we get to see how they come to the conclusions, tend to look into their identity, and even get to see how relationships can evolve and devolve based off of the respect for their identity. As one of their friendships ends up devolving based off of I forget his name, but that's not important. The dude's refusal to actually accept their identity, along with him slowly going a little crazy. DC has quite the history of being able to show these types of relationships along with all of their levelness, all their different dynamics, and being able to put... I know that there's more characters, but my brain is frankly just fried at the moment. So let's just say, kudos to you, DC, you have made it. This is from Young Justice, by the way. It is magnificent. Wonderful show. Non-binary characters could also be seen in one of the loveliest movies that has so far came out, Nimona. While the books tend to go a little bit more in depth, in it we get to see the love-hate relationship between Sir Ambrosius Gius Goldenloin, which is magnificent, and Lord Ballister Blackheart. And in this story... One second, brain break. Brain break. Brain break done. Enough. Or at least I think. We get to see Nimona, a wonderful, badass character who, frankly, we need more of, because it has been very rare that we actually get, that in the media we get to see a female or non-binary character. In the movie, she's female. In the book, I think she's non-binary. Maybe. It depends on what the that's our gender fluid. I should have researched that a little bit better. But it tends to vary. But in the movie, Nimona is simply Nimona. A wonderful character who has energy, spunk, character that we just often don't see in the portrayal of media, especially in women. I'm looking at you, anime. But this is a wonderful show because it was one of the, what I believe to be one of the first movies that were specifically made for children that gets to show a homosexual kiss on screen between these two little lovebirds. But through it we get to see and debate what good is, what society is, how what standards are meant to be broken and changed. And it is very wonderful addressing it. And it was a movie that was originally rejected by Disney because of that single case. Speaking of Disney, we must now get on to the bad. Representation to a lot of companies and all of that sort has often just been shoved in willy-nilly without any development, thought, character planning, or anything of that sort, just to say that they hit the quota. For example, one of Disney's first LGBT representations was between Gaston's henchman and whoever the blin this is. We do not learn about these characters, we do not care about these characters, and yet is the only thing that we were given by Disney for years. And frankly, it's just not a good representation, because who would want that sort of representation that is simply off-screen to the side with characters that nobody cares or wants. And it doesn't help either that, again, this was Gaston's henchman. The semi-evil henchman, which ties back into how LGBT representation, especially in past media, was only allowed for the morally wrong characters. Other shows do this slightly better, not necessarily well. A lot of what happens this time is that they will take a background character and decide to bring them into the light by making their only personality that of being the representation diversity quota. This can be shown in her Dixie, where Cricket, this lovely woman, comes out as a lesbian, and while that is a fun journey, we do not know of her as a character for the most part, aside from that lesbianism. The one thing I do give credit to the show for is that it tended to contradict the stereotypes, as many lesbian characters portrayed in media are extremely butch and are often rejecting feminine things that they would have originally liked in order to actually fit that quota. And I very much appreciate that in this show, one can like women and also still like the things that come with being a woman, which is frankly kind of rare. Now, this can also be handled poorly in main character relationships. For example, we come to the Legend of Korra, a couple that has been held only by its fan base, and the fan fiction, and the comics, and all of that loveliness. Because in the show, there is nothing. These two, throughout the many seasons of The Legends of Korra, have been shown to hate each other, not really care for one another, and interact with one another only as needed. There have also been many things put up between them, as they were often shown fighting over the same boy for some reason, and only for them in the very end, the final episode, to go into the sunset together, with no build-up, no characterization, no investment into their relationship. Because it is one thing in order to have an LGBT character on screen, but it doesn't count if you, or at least to my eyes, it doesn't count if you don't actually put in the effort. While this is done with the main characters, this is the equivalent of what Disney has been doing for ages. Yes, they're technically good guys, but it's been shoved in the background at the very end, with no build-up, no payoff, no interest, only in order to fill a quota, which makes it feel cheap and unneeded. Because would be frankly wonderful to actually have the Legends, well, 1 second, brain break. To have this investment be a lot better, but no, we do not get that, because, God forbid, you take a second between the love triangles to actually make it a love triangle. Moving on. The one, the only, the brilliant, the Legends of Vox Machina that has taken over my heart and soul. It is what I believe to be the best representation, well, maybe not the best, but I am extremely biased, of LGBT characters. And it shows how you can have side characters that you make become investments. For example, Kima and Allura, wonderful couple that we get to see reoccurring throughout the seasons, that we get build up to, that we get to see the history of. Because the show writers actually care about the pairing. This is what the Legend of Korra should have been. Maybe not exactly, but you get my point. And while there are many other characters which are fun, such as Baxeldan being bisexual, but having it not be neglected or based off of his partners again, which is very nice, we also get to see a few non-binary characters, such as the Emprix of a nation's name that I have forgotten. and whose name I have also forgotten. Because frankly, they are a background character. The thing that I will allow more so is because this show is so densely packed with representation that it allows for background representation to feel less cheap. Yes, because the main characters have been shown to be part of the community. There are side characters that have been made to become more important. There are recurring characters that come back, such as Gilmore, that representation that in other cases would have been shoved in stands on its own feet. It's because of the fact of how much there is and how normalized it has become that it's not just a cheap use to it. One of the things that I would also like to talk about is asexuality. Something that the media has kind of tried its best to erase. Right. We're going to start off with the not best example, simply because chances are it will be erased later. Between Caitlin and Vi. This is from one of the best shows I have ever seen, Arcane, with women written better than perhaps 90% of anime combined and multiplied, though frankly 0 times 0 is nothing. But in it, we can understand that they care for each other, we can understand that they support one another, and there is implied to be something between them as a relationship that has been established without them having to have any sexual or implications toward it. As many times what happens with the establishment of characters and their relationships is the kiss, the falling into bed, the anything of that sort. It's always to a sexual degree. And yet, this show is able to give a pair that we know are explicitly together without having to do any of that because of the show, because of the care and empathy and dedication that they show to one another. But what is perhaps the best example is Good Omens. I danced my senior solo to that one. But in this show, we follow a demon and an angel who have been in love with each other for 6,000 years. We have been shown that they care for one another. We have been shown that they can encourage and lead to the growth of one another. More so in the book than in the show, though frankly the show is also interesting. And it never has to be said explicit. They never has to be shown to the audience that they care for each other on a deeper level for us to understand that they do. It's frankly just wonderful. Because it is very annoying to have wonderful characters not actually be able to care for each other, or just the awkward scenes that often come up with movies. But what I really like about the asexual representation is what it shows what actual relationships are based off. The communication, the skill, the growth, the fact that you genuinely want the best for the other. And I believe these shows tend to portray it better than anything else. Finally, representation in kid shows. Now, what we can see, as Legend of Korra is also a kid show, along with the Adventure Time show, the difference between actually creating build-up and care and sympathy between one another, and just shoving in plot elements at the end. Because yes, while Korra and me did kiss at the very end, so did Marceline and Bubblegum, the difference in it lies between the friendship, the connection, the fact that they have been able to show that they have made sacrifices for each other throughout the ages for the other's benefit and happiness. And I believe that is just frankly wonderful. Another wonderful kid show that I enjoy is Ever After High. I'm not sure, it is definitely not the first homosexual Kiss Hot Screen, but it frankly is still relatively important. In the show, more or less, everything is tied to fate, and frankly, this requires a lot of context to understand why this is so important. But more or less, the fact that Darling was able to wake up Applewhite with a kiss meant that officially and by destiny, they were meant to be together. It is one thing in order to have two characters get together. It is another thing to imply that they are meant to be, especially in children's shows, which frankly is just wonderful, because this, in essence, was showing that there is nothing wrong, there is nothing toxic, there is nothing of that sort in order to be worried about. But more than anything, the best representation, what I like to believe, comes from Monster High. This is a show that has tackled racism, sexism, classism, along with having many LGBT disabilities, and frankly, anything that you could have possibly thought. And it's magnificent for it. It's been evolving throughout the ages, and the evolution can be judged. But there are some good things. For example, the most recent one. Frankenstein has been changed to a non-binary character in the most recent series, which frankly makes sense to me as Frankenstein. It kind of makes sense that you'd want to identify as something more than just one, if you're made up of multiple parts. The one downside that I will say is that they removed him from being the main character. And what would have been absolutely wonderful was seeing that character start out the first days of their life and slowly come to the realization that instead of identifying as that they better identified with they. But taking the coward's route out, they shoved him to the side. In earlier things, we also get to see a lot of lovely hints, such as Claudine Wolf, a character that was originally lesbian, but in the new cases was erased. Why, I do not know. And the thing is, you can see this implication without having to have had established relationships. This could be seen in funny little episodes, this could be seen in hints, and it was always, and without explicitly showing it, because frankly at the time they wouldn't have been able to, there were ways that you could gather it, the information, and frankly this show is just the best thing that I could possibly say that a child would want to watch in order to understand the main issues of the world, as it is wonderful at tackling them, wonderful at showing them, and it truly shows that everyone should be aware and conscious and accept their freaky flaws, as they call them, or whatever the thing is that makes them unique. And with that, and my having talked for God knows how long and actually succeeding, the video is done! Thank you all for watching this exorbitantly large amount of thing. Goodbye.